Hey everyone, welcome to the Journalist Podcast with me, Kritika Narayanan. Every Monday, I will be talking about journalists who inspire me, and I will start with a woman journalist who is a pioneer in investigative journalism in a time when women were not taken seriously in the field of journalism. She was a fighter for women's rights too, and her name was Elizabeth Cochrane, better known by her pen name Nellie Bly. She lived during the 1800s, and writing under a pen name was customary for women journalists at that time. Let me tell you about how she became a journalist. There was a newspaper then called the Pittsburgh Dispatch, which had a column called What Girls Are Good For. This column was a sexist one, which mostly reported that girls are good only for taking care of the household and children. In the 1800s, this was a totally acceptable column for a newspaper, but not for Miss Nellie Bly. She was angry at the newspaper and wrote a response to the editor under the pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl. The editor of the newspaper was impressed with her writing and even ran an advertisement asking the author to identify herself. When Elizabeth Cochrane stepped forward, the editor asked her to write for the newspaper. And she did, under the pen name Nellie Bly. Her first article was about how divorce affects women and why reforms to divorce laws were important. In her early 20s, she even briefly worked as a foreign correspondent in Mexico, where she wrote articles criticizing the Mexican government for curtailing the freedom of the press. She was mostly asked to cover stories of art, fashion, society, or gardening, as these were the stories mostly delegated to women journalists at that time. But Nellie wanted to do more serious work. She became so bored with covering such stories that she quit the Pittsburgh Dispatch and went to New York to find a job. But finding work was very difficult for women at that time. But eventually, she started to work for Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, The New York World. Pulitzer, yes. Awards for excellence in journalism are given in his name every year, but that is a story for another time. Back to Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly took a rather peculiar first assignment for Joseph Pulitzer. She agreed to pretend to be insane and investigate reports of cruelty at the women's lunatic asylum at Blackwell's Island. She checked herself into the asylum and witnessed firsthand the horrors there and how the women living there suffered. After 10 days, she was released from the asylum with the help of her journalist employers. Her investigative report on the asylum, 10 Days in a Madhouse, was an instant hit and made her incredibly famous. But she did not stop there. She convinced her editor that she would make a trip around the world like the famous fictional character Phileas Fogg from Around the World in 80 Days. Nellie Bly was a fearless reporter, and she traveled alone for most part of the trip and made the trip around the world in just 72 days, which was a world record at that time. She covered the story of women fighting for their right to vote during the suffrage movement in 1913 and World War I. Women in journalism doing wonders no matter what time they were living in. Nellie Bly is one of my most favorite and inspiring journalists of all times. I hope you were inspired too. This is Kritika Narayanan signing off.